Any new media or industry that grows rapidly is going to be criticized. That's just because the older, more established media have been around, and a lot of adults can be very conservative. They may not have an open mind to new things that weren't around when they were growing up, and are replacing the things they grew up with. Over the years, I've seen this standard image of a child playing a video game in which the child is alone in a darkened room with his face very close to the TV, with the light of the TV reflecting off his face, holding the controller and just staring at the TV. I'd really like to be able to change that image of video games into something that's a little more positive. Shigeru Miyamoto. If you were born in the 1990s or 2000s, one of your very first experiences with technology is most likely a video game. With the advent of tablets and mobile devices, video games are being introduced at a younger and younger age. There are even games now designed specifically for babies. Video games today are big business. The current video game industry is booming, but in the 1980s, that industry almost fell apart. Video games have continually gained in popularity for the past 30 years. However, the first video games appeared over 50 years ago. What was the first video game? To determine what the first video game was, a definition of the term video game has got to be established. A video game is a game played by electronically manipulating images displayed on a video screen, such as a television, a computer monitor, a tablet, or a cell phone. The computer program or software creates a video signal that is transmitted to the display screen and is converted into an image on that screen. Games that can only be viewed by printing something and not on a display screen, we would call those an electronic game or a computer game, but not a video game. The first appearance of what we would call a video game was called the Cathode ray tube amusement device, first patented on January 25, 1947 by Thomas T. Goldsmith Jr. and Esel Ray Mann. The goal of the game was to hit a target using a gun. This is the first device that falls under our definition of video games. The first video games by our modern definitions appeared in the aftermath of World War II, when extremely large computers located in different universities were reprogrammed to perform a variety of tasks. In the 1950s, research projects backed by large corporations and universities were created to build games that were primarily used for academics, training, and research and promotional purposes, rather than as a form of entertainment. These games were designed and developed for use on such unique and extremely expensive hardware that the first video games were really only ever used by scientists and university personnel. Video games had indeed been born, however, they were not quite ready for public use. The research that took place in this period of time happened at such a fast pace, and systems were constantly being created, set up, then torn down, that it was really hard to tell who developed the first video games and who introduced what video game genre first, because it wasn't really highly publicized. In 1948, Alan Turing and David Champernowne started to program a theoretical chess simulation that they dubbed TuroChamp, and although it was never programmed into a computer, by 1950 it was complete, and it's still considered one of the first computer games ever programmed. The first attempt to play the program on a physical computer was in 1952 on a Ferranti Mark I, but it failed to run because of hardware limitations. Instead, Turing would act like a computer and execute the program on paper. The first game of computer chess ever played was between Turing and his colleague Alec Glennie, who was a computer scientist. According to Christoph Teuscher, in his book titled Alan Turing, Life and Legacy of a Great Thinker, both during and after the war, Turing experimented with machine routines for playing chess. In the absence of a computer, the machine's behavior was simulated by hand using paper and pencil. But someone was eventually able to get the chess game to run on an actual computer. In that same book, Teuscher goes on to say, Dietrich Prinz wrote the first chess program to be implemented. It ran in November 1951 on the Ferranti Mark I. Unlike the TurboChamp, Prinz's program could not play a complete game. despite the failures of some computer games to run without the help of some human. Some games did fully function on the computers of the time. For example, Bertie the Brain was a tic-tac-toe game played on a 4-meter tall computer. It was showcased in the 1950 Canadian National Exhibition and allowed people to play a game of tic-tac-toe against an artificial intelligence. Another example is Nimrod, which was created in the UK for the 1951 Festival of Britain by John Bennett and Raymond Stewart Williams. Nimrod was a 12 by 9 by 5 foot computer that allowed people to play a virtual game of Nim. The Nim player pressed buttons on a raised panel to select their moves, and the Nimrod moved afterwards, with its move calculations shown by more lights. Bertie the Brain and Nim were the first two computer games that actually existed inside a computer and were fully functioning video games. OXO was another early tic-tac-toe game. It was developed by A.S. Douglas on the University of Cambridge's EDSAC computer in 1952 as part of his human-computer interactions research. OXO was actually one of the first video games to have a visual display. 5 years later, in 1957, Alex Bernstein creates the first complete computer checkers game called the Bernstein chess program that ran on an IBM 704 computer. This game was so advanced for the time that it could read 4 moves ahead of the player.
What can we learn about thinking from a game of chess? One challenging approach has been made by mathematician Alex Bernstein, based on this ancient, intellectually demanding game with its complex moves and its endlessly varying patterns of play. If chess had been played at the rate of 1 million games a second since the beginning of recorded time, only a small fraction of all the possible games would yet have been played. No human being can play a perfect game of chess, and neither can any conceivable machine. To find out how good a game of chess a machine might play, Mr. Bernstein and his collaborators prepared a chess-playing program for the IBM 704.
It's widely agreed that the first video game ever created that was not just a demo and was built with the intention of actually being a game people would play was called Tennis for Two. Tennis for Two was a sports game built by Robert Deverak and William Higginbotham at the Brookhaven National Laboratory in 1958. This game was designed to be played at the Brookhaven Open House, showing a representation of a tennis court. Players would use the analog computer controls, and the game would be viewed by an eager audience on an oscilloscope. Although extremely successful, the designers at the time could not capitalize on the commercial potential of this game due to the technology limitations at the time. Overall, computers at the time had very limited memory and processing speeds, and this made them very unqualified for running games. The expense and the scarce nature of computers meant that computer time was allocated to what was perceived as more important academic and scientific experiments. The development of the Whirlwind 1 computer, built by a team led by Jay Forrester at MIT in the early 1950s, allowed the processing of commands in real time and introduced a faster and more reliable random access memory, or RAM as we know of today. Until the Whirlwind was developed, computers were dedicated to processing a single task at a time, as opposed to running tasks in parallel. This led the way to the development of other computers that operated in real time, allowing for programmers to be able to interact with their computers and get an immediate response. For the first time, this real-time interactive programming allowed university students direct access to a computer for their own research and studies. Universities eventually allowed their students to use laboratory computers outside of the normal class hours, and also gave access to faculty for research when the computers were not busy with academic and scientific study. This increased access sparked the creation of a community of undergraduate students who started learning together and conducting new experiments on these computers, expanding their programming knowledge and capabilities. John Bergeson, a computer programmer working at IBM, took the day off sick from work one day in 1961. He started to program a computer baseball simulator. 1 month later, John and his brother Paul ran the game on an IBM 1620, and it is the first known baseball video game. Such experiments in programming would go on to influence future programmers and help to produce the first popular computer game among students called Space War. Space War was the brainchild of Steve Russell, Martin Greets, and Wayne Wiedenen, and was created in 1961. Once the idea was fully thought out, planned and scoped out, the programming of the game was started by Russell, Saunders, Greets, Sampson, and Dan Edwards the following year. Ripped right out of the pages of the science fiction stories written by E.E. Smith, you were pitted against your friends in a virtual duel between two spaceships, with a custom-built control box for each player. That game spread like wildfire amongst university students and became especially popular with the students at MIT. As computers became less scarce and researchers were able to spend more time developing and sharing what they had learned, we started to see the rise of some sophisticated programming languages that we see today, like BASIC, which stands for Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code. The BASIC programming language was created by John Kemeny and Thomas Kurtz at Dartmouth College in 1964, which made programming accessible to a larger audience. Students and faculty members became obsessed with their new hobby, and it gave technically minded people a creative outlet for their ideas, creating the first computer-based virtual worlds. As the art of programming progressed, we started to see the rise of some of the familiar game genres that we know today. These new creations were passionately passed around from student to student and university to university, being obsessively played by students hungry for these virtual adventures. Due to the limitations of hardware, however, and a lack of computers in the home as the PC or personal computer had yet to be invented, video games were trapped on expensive university machines in labs that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. This would all change as the 1970s approached, because computers and their components started becoming more affordable. This prompted a vision of a new industry, and commercialization opportunities started becoming clear. By the end of the 1960s, the interest in new technologies and research and development was growing at an accelerated rate.
This may not look like an antique, but in a sense it is. It's from one of the first IBM computers. It could solve problems in a few minutes that would have taken a team of mathematicians months to do, but it used vacuum tubes. Remember your old radio? And while these tubes may not seem so big to us, to an engineer or scientist, they pose gigantic problems. Engineers and scientists wanted to make computers faster. They wanted to make millions of calculations possible in the blink of an eye. So they needed switches that were 1,000 times faster. Today, all those tubes and other electronic components have been compressed onto a tiny chip made from the purest silicon crystal. This chip that can fit through the eye of a needle can do the work of 1,000 vacuum tubes. Now those millions of calculations can be done in the blink of an eye.
Because of new technologies emerging like the invention of the microchip, the cost of computing equipment started to drop, and instead of computers costing over $100,000, prices dropped below $10,000, which was about the average annual income for a person living in the United States at the time. Although this price tag was far too high for the average home player, this triggered a reawakening in the coin-operated games industry. Companies in Japan were reimagining the electromechanical games that were so popular in the 1950s, like pinball machines. An electromechanical game is any coin-operated game that has no motor and is operated without the use of a microprocessor. Companies with familiar names like Sega originated these elaborate designs and sound effects that are so familiar with us today in arcade games. Sega's electromechanical game Periscope, first revealed in 1966, was a massive success and incidentally was the first arcade game ever to cost $0.25 to play, setting the tone as the established price for all arcade games for the next decade. The next year, in 1967, Taito Games released Crown Soccer Special, a sports game for two that was essentially a soccer simulation pinball machine. The soccer simulator, however, used electronic versions of pinball flippers and assorted electronic components. For the duration of the 1970s, many different companies continued to release an almost hybrid of video games, mixed with the old-style electromechanical games. These games, however, were largely replaced with what we would recognize today as an actual arcade video game. The earliest known coin-operated video game was set up by students at Stanford University and was called Galaxy Game, a game based on their favorite university multiplayer game, Space War. However, Pong, released in 1972 by Atari, helped accelerate the growth and success of the coin-operated arcade industry today. Pong was the first sports arcade game and was so popular that when it was tested out in Andy Capp's Tavern in Sunnyvale, California, it was played so much that it got jammed up with quarters and stopped working. This was an amazing time for gaming enthusiasts, as familiar names like Sega, Nintendo, and Atari were releasing amazing games and peripherals like the revolutionary light gun. Games like Wild Gunman, Killer Shark stirred the imagination of what was yet to come in the world of video games. The success of these video games ushered in an era of copycats, and soon the market was flooded with thousands of variations of the same games. Attempting to break away from these copycats, larger companies like Midway and Atari focused their energies on creating new genres. A popular game from this era was called Gunfight by Midway, and it was one of the first games in the arcade to utilize a microprocessor, starting a trend towards programmed video games rather than relying on hardware. Video game arcades developed strong partnerships with a brand new idea called a shopping mall. Once people saw the success of how a coin-operated arcade could be successfully run in a shopping mall, other entrepreneurs followed suit, and soon we had an explosion of shopping malls across the Americas. Inside almost all of these new shopping malls was a video game arcade. As pinball games started to adopt microprocessing technology more and more, we eventually started to see people gravitate towards them once again, taking the focus away from video games just for a little while. There were, however, still some large players in the video game industry like Atari, who released Breakout in 1976, which was built by Steve Wozniak, aided by Steve Jobs, to an eager and hungry population for video games. And Midway and Taito's release of Space Invaders in 1979 also provided a huge boost to this industry. Within the next year, 60,000 Space Invaders arcade games would be sold in the US. The American company Magnavox was the first to release a video game system for the home, called the Magnavox Odyssey.
What does your family do on those stay indoors rainy afternoons, or on those cold, blustery winter days? Families who are content to let television do its thing often find themselves at its mercy for a choice of entertainment, while people who want television to do their thing entertain themselves with Odyssey, the electronic game of the future, and the family's best foul-weather friend.
It was released in the United States in September of 1972 and overseas in 1973. It was developed by a relatively small team led by Ralph H. Baer at Saunders & Associates. While Saunders was working at L'Oreal, it was requested that he create, quote, the best television set in the world, quote. He presented the idea of having the ability to be able to play games on the screens of televisions. However, it was passed up by his boss. Saunders, now working at Saunders Associated, remembered the idea he had, and he went on to develop the brown box prototype, which eventually became the Magnavox Odyssey. The Odyssey had an angular design. It was black, white, and brown in color, and this home console had the ability to display 3 square dots on a monochromatic black and white screen. The behavior of the dots would depend on the game you're playing, with the players placing a plastic screen overlay on top of their TV screens to create the visuals. Up to 2 players would control the dots on the screen using the knobs and 1 button on the controller within the guidelines of the rules of the game. The Odyssey had a moderate success, selling between 69,000 and 100,000 units by 1973, and selling over 350,000 units before the console was discontinued in 1975. The marginal success of this home console was protected by patents that Ralph H. Baer had issued for the console and the games. Patents that Saunders and Magnavox would need to defend continually, prompting one judge to describe their patent as the pioneering patent of the video game art. Related lawsuits would earn them over $100 million in the next 20 years. Although it was not a major commercial success by today's standards, the Odyssey brought about the rise of the commercial video game industry and created the first generation of video game consoles. This is to be distinguished from an arcade game or a home computer. With the personal computer hardware beginning to evolve, the creation of home consoles just started to emerge on the markets. Around 1975, Magnavox had released the Odyssey 100 and the Odyssey 200. At the same time, Atari had released its own home console through the Sears Sporting Goods department, named Home Pong, to bewildering success. Fairchild Semiconductors released their console, the Fairchild Channel F, the following year. Before the release of the Fairchild Channel F, users could only play games that were coded directly into the consoles, making the Fairchild Channel F revolutionary, as it was the first console to include its own microchip and the first one to use cartridges. But their popularity was shunted when Atari came out with the Atari VCS, the Atari Video Computer System. They became the console market leader in 1977. The commercial video game revolution was about to begin.